Mr. Russ Brown, your pension's going to expire in 15 seconds if you don't listen to me. Russ! Hi. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I had a gavel, but I was afraid to use it, so lead off whoever, I don't know who's first, but
Thank
your
you.
discussion.
Thank you, Chair Hoppin and members of the board. I'm Dave Modisett. I'm the director of the California Municipal Utilities Association. The association is a statewide association of both publicly owned electric utilities and water agencies. So we have members that are generating hydroelectric power. We also have members that are pumping large volumes of water throughout the state. Just a little about the structure of the panel. I'm going to give just some very brief background remarks about hydropower. And then I'm going to turn it over for the bulk of the presentation to the other two panelists, and they're going to focus on the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project systems and the hydro resources and operation within those systems. And then I'm going to close it out with just two concluding slides. I might note that the panel immediately following ours is the state energy agencies. And I got a chance to see their presentation this morning. They're going to go into much greater detail on the tools and models and work that needs to be done. So I think between the two panels, you're going to get a really good briefing today. So let me just start. I guess first of all, here's a map of California with with most of the hydroelectric projects on it. There's not quite 400 hydroelectric power plants in the state. Of course, we get some hydroelectric power from outside the state as well. About 13,000 megawatts of installed capacity, representing roughly a little over 14% of the state's total power system. Of those hydropower resources, the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project make up about 30% of total hydropower installed capacity. I would probably just note, too, that although we're focusing today on the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project, that this Phase 2 review and any decisions you make will be informing the decisions on Phase 4, which will also include tributaries with significant hydropower resources.
Dave, do you have any breakdown of what percentage of that power that's generated by the state and federal project is actually consumed by them?
These gentlemen will give you those figures. So, let's see, where did I go? I guess first of all, just by way of background, electricity is a pretty unique commodity in that it has to be produced and consumed almost instantaneously. So, I mean, literally we have people sitting in darkened rooms throughout the state and each utility service area and balancing authority that are adjusting demand and supply constantly every few seconds and even minutes, or every few minutes and even seconds, because for all practical purposes, electricity can't be stored. There is one exception to that, of course, and that is that we have some ability to store electricity in the form of water behind our reservoirs. And that's really what makes hydroelectric power so valuable, in that it is flexible. It is a way for us to store and manage electricity. And one of the primary benefits of hydropower and this flexibility is the ability to meet peak loads in the summer. We can use hydroelectric power when it's most valuable to us, and we do that when we need it the most, which is in the summer periods when we have the highest demand for electricity, primarily to meet air conditioning loads throughout the state. Here's just a graphic of monthly hydropower generation on the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project systems. The vertical axis is energy in gigawatt hours. The horizontal axis is by month. And what you can see from this is that we are choosing to use that hydro generation in the summer months, again when we need it the most. Additional benefits of hydropower, obviously it's a carbon-free source of energy. We're actually avoiding about 30 million metric tons of carbon emissions every year because of the hydropower we have. It's actually the most economical source of power available to us today. As Tim and others will talk about more, it's really become essential for grid operations support because of its ability to ramp it up and down quickly. It also contributes to what utility jargon refers to as ancillary services. That's actually a suite of services that ramped electricity can provide, and it needs to be provided, such as voltage regulation in individual areas. And then lastly, hydropower's flexibility is crucial for the future development of renewable energy resources. All utilities in California are under a mandate to have 33% renewables in their portfolios by the year 2020. That's actually going to be quite a difficult task to achieve, and the difficulty really comes in the variability which is inherent in most of the renewable resources, particularly wind and solar. The wind doesn't blow all the time, sun is not shining all the time, and we need to have some capability in other resources to be able to fill in the gaps when those resources are not producing, and hydropower is one of the best ways for us to be able to do that. So with that, what I'm going to do now is to introduce the other two speakers. First of all, speaking about the State Water Project is Tim Haynes, who's the manager for energy, and then immediately following him is going to be Jerry Tengas with the Northern California Power Association, who's going to talk about the Central Valley Project.
I just want to interrupt just briefly. While I 100% agree with you about hydropower and its importance to our system, one of the areas that is developing, which can serve as a, it's not there yet, is biofuels and bioenergy, because that too has a battery effect on renewables, and that's one of the things that the administration is really pushing hard on, to not just have to rely completely on hydro.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. I would mention two storage technologies too is a new set of technologies, has a very high cost right now, but we're all working on storage technologies. So I agree completely. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Tim Haynes with the State Water Contractors. I'm just going to get into the substance of my presentation. I think that you're somewhat familiar with the State Water Contractors. When I was first introduced to the water quality objectives, my first instinct was that we've got to be careful, because there's a possibility that the objectives could be at cross purposes with the state energy policy. State energy policy is largely set forth in AB 32 and SB 2X1, and they're driven by concerns associated with global climate change. Dave alluded to 33% renewables that are mandated to be in place by 2020, that we are to reduce the carbon footprint of the state of California to below 1990 levels also by 2020. And those are captured in AB 32, SB 2X1 as well. What we see when we look at where those lead us is that they're placing a greater demand on the power system for flexible generation. And that then leads to how it is that we might run into some problems with the water quality objectives. If there is flow criteria or something like that that has a potential to impact on the flexible hydro generation that's associated with the State Water Project, CVP, or others, what will happen is that we could be eliminating flexible generation from the power system. And so that leads to some concerns about how it is that we can align the water and energy policy. Just real briefly, to give you some background on the State Water Project, as you know, it spans the state. There is generation and pumping facilities that make up the hydro facilities for the State Water Project that also span the state. And so we have generation at the northernmost reaches, generation at the southernmost reaches, generation in between, amounting to about 1,750 megawatts. The hydro generation produces around 4,000 gigawatt hours, consumes around 7,500 gigawatt hours. So Chair Hoppen, going to your question about how much of our pumping demand do we meet with our own hydro production, you can see that it's a little over 50%. These are numbers that you may not have any real perspective for, and what I'll try and do is bring you along as we go through the presentation. But as you're probably accustomed to, the scale of the State Water Project is significant. It's the single largest end user of the power grid in California. If you were going to equate it with electric utilities, it would be the second or the sixth largest electric utility in the state of California. And then just another thing to bear in mind as you're considering the hydroelectric facilities within the State Water Project, they have a design that includes inherent flexibility. And so what that means is that there are the opportunities within limits to be able to choose when it is that power is generated, when it is that power is consumed. And what happens as a result of that inherent flexibility is that there are statewide benefits that carry through. And I'll try and touch on a couple of those as we go through the presentation.
Jim, can I ask you a question before you get into that? I will acknowledge that having gone through the Cal ISO plant and watched that operation was probably one of the most intimidating things a person that's generally mechanically inclined has ever experienced. It was, you know, quite a daunting process. But, you know, I don't know if you were here earlier in the day when people talked about, you know, the need for pulse flows and releases that were mandated by biological opinions and what have you. Are you generally able to, when there are releases that are mandated for environmental purposes, you know, not talking about what we're going to do here, but currently, are you able to utilize the power that is incrementally generated by demands on the system that aren't of your origination, if you will?
Power production and consumption in the State Water Project follows the flow of water. And so what happens is that when water needs to be released or when water can be pumped, what will happen is that's how the system is going to be operated. Now within that, there are the ability to be able to shape when it is that we would generate power. What Dave alluded to earlier is that we can pump more water during the off-peak hours when it's less expensive, when there's not as much of a demand on the system. But conversely, what we can do is we can generate most of the power during those on-peak hours. And so within limits, there is the capability to be able to shape the pumping and generation from the project.
Yeah, just following up on that, like a pulse flow down to Trinity, which happened in August of this year, up to the limit of being able to put the cubic feet per second through the generators, you can generate electricity. But usually you have to put more water in the river than what can go through the pumping plant. So then you got to bypass generation. So there's a mixture. You can flux up to what the maximum capability of plants are, and then beyond that you got to bypass the
You
plant.
can't necessarily put it all through the penstock on the generators.
Not if the pulse flows are
Okay.
higher than that.
Thank you.
I've made representations with regard to the state energy policy. The takeaway that I would ask you to have with this slide is that what's happening is that changes in the state energy policy are increasing the complexity of the operation of the power grid, and they're happening at an ever-increasing rate. If you go to the upper left-hand side of the slide, what you'll see is what is characterized, or the structure of the utilities during the 1960 to 1998 time period. It was vertically integrated utilities that we use in order to be able to supply customers with relatively economic power and maintain the reliability of the grid. Vertically integrated means that they own their own generation, they own their own transmission, and their own distribution systems. In 1998, there was restructuring legislation that that occurred, and what we saw from that is the divestiture of the generating assets from the investor-owned utilities, the creation of the Cal ISO and Cal PX, Cal ISO to operate the power system, and the purpose of this period of time is to introduce competition into the marketplace. And with that, greater complexity. An example is something that we're probably all aware of is that it was during the early portion of this period where we encountered the energy crises. And so, it's just an example of where it is that we introduced complexity, got a little bit ahead of ourselves, and had to try and figure out how to recover from that. Now, not even 10 years after the restructuring legislation, what we see is another change in the state energy policy, and it begins with the passage of AB 32. It's the law that requires carbon reduction. It introduces the need to integrate renewables at ever-increasing amounts. It's followed in 2011 by SB 2X1 that increase the amount of renewables, and then there are a couple of other mandates that are listed there that are also part of the energy policy that we're trying to figure out how it is that we manage the operation of the system around. What's happening is that with this, we'll go from a relatively simple model in operating the power system and increase the complexity of it. Where this leads is the need for the power system to be able to have more flexible generation than what it would have had in the early years of the operation of the power system. Now, here's I apologize, and I'll try and unpack this for you. Along the bottom axis of this curve are the hours in the day, so midnight through the 24 hours. Along the vertical axis is the amount of power that is being placed on the power system as a result of wind generation. This is a graphic representation of every day in the month of April 2006, where wind is generating onto the power system. You could fast forward to April of 2012, and really the only thing that you would see changing is that there would be more wind that would be on the power system. You'd still have the unpredictability that is associated with when that power is going to be produced, when it is that it's going to show up on the power grid. Most of the renewable resources that are going to be added as a result of the legislation will be intermittent resources like this: wind, solar power. And so what happens is that they demand that there be other generating resources that are able to dampen out the intermittent effects that you see that are associated with these resources. The one thing that I would say, the one takeaway that you can make from this with some predictability is that wind is going to produce predominantly during the off-peak hours. And so conversely, solar energy is going to be producing the majority of its power during the off-peak. And that leads to another set of slides that are intended to be able to help you understand where it is that flexible generation or the need for additional flexible generation.
Tim, did I misunderstand you, or did you say that solar would predominantly produce energy in off-peak?
I'm sorry, if I said off-peak, that was wrong. On-peak.
Okay. I'm confused a lot. I wanted to make sure I wasn't confused on that. Thank you.
Was there
I didn't want you
anything
to think
else?
we weren't listening to you.
Sorry. Was there anything else that came to mind from that?
I'll tell you later. The other one was pretty bad.
In this slide, Again, on the upper left-hand corner, what you have is on the horizontal axis, the hours in the day. On the vertical axis, it's the total expected demand that's being placed on the power system during a typical winter day in 2020. What we see is that at midnight, the total generation or the total demand is around 21,000 megawatts. It continues to fall off into the wee hours of the morning. At around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, you see that the demand for power begins to pick up as people wake up, they begin their day, businesses open. You see the trend line continue up until mid-morning. It flattens out. And then you see that again during the early evening hours as folks begin to go home, the evening activities begin. There's another ramp up in the demand for power. And then as the day unfolds, or the day comes to an end, what you see is the demand for power fall off. In the lower right-hand slide, what the ISO has done is superimposed what it expects that from the demand curve in the left will be after the wind power and the solar power are used in order to be able to meet the demand. So then what you see is the change in the shape that the power system is now going to be responding to. Some are similar, but you can see that there's considerable differences, particularly in the middle of the day. The thing to keep in mind is that the power system over decades has been designed basically to serve the load shape in the upper left hand. Now what we're entering into under the new policy is a shape that looks dramatically different.
Tim, is there any difference in the definition of flexible generation and peaker capacity? Are they one and the same, or is there a difference?
There is a difference between the two. Peaking capacity is something that you would expect would be operated only during those peak hours during a day, and so you might expect that a peaking generation resource is going to operate 10% of the time or less. A flexible generation, intermediate generation type resource is going to operate more hours through the year. It'll be more efficient. It will be more capital intensive to build, and not so much a racehorse type of power generator. As
It wouldn't
as you
have
see.
the ramp up and ramp down capacities that a peaker would then?
I'm sorry, I
It
didn't.
wouldn't have the ramp up and ramp down, time frames and flexibility that a peaker plant would have, or?
It will have some of the same characteristics. Maybe what I can do is go to
The main difference is that it just operates for a longer period of time, is that correct?
the main difference, I would say, is that a flexible combined cycle power plant is going to be more efficient to operate than a peaking resource. And so it's in part why it is that you would expect that a peaking resource is only operated 10% of the time. It's just, it's prohibitively expensive to run. It's not competitive in the marketplace.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm able to go back to the last slide. Wait.
That
One forward. There's another point that I would make with regard to the demand profile on the right-hand side. And as Dave had alluded to, what happens is that the wind generation and the solar production are susceptible to just changes in wind pattern and the solar intensity. And those changes can take place within an hour. And so what you don't see in this curve is the on and off effect of those the changes in those patterns. And so what that leads to is the need for different types of flexible resources in order to be able to meet the demand of the power system. And those instantaneous changes, you need a resource that is going to be able to change almost instantaneously. And in these other instances where you're ramping up and down, the characteristics of your generation or the product is going to change as well. This first, Dave mentioned ancillary services in his discussion. These represent different ancillary services that the flexible generation is able to provide to the power system. Regulation is something that provides that shock absorber effect. And so for those changes in power consumption that happen on a near instantaneous basis, there's going to be a demand for generation that's going to be able to track that. And then as you go down the list, what happens is that you have a longer time between when it is that you are going to have a generator respond to a change in the conditions on the power system, where you go from minutes to 10 minutes to almost an hour. These are the type of products and services that are going to be in greater demand on the power system as a result of the intermittent resources. They're the type of products and services that are provided through the State Water Project or other hydro resources as well. That is what's going to be needed in terms of products and services just in the normal course of business. This next slide describes an emergency service that hydropower, the State Water Project in particular, is able to provide. The ISO periodically encounters emergency situations on the power grid, and what it has to do is go beyond its normal markets in order to be able to find a way to mitigate that emergency. And in this case, in September of 2010, June of this year, what the ISO has done is turn to the State Water Project, and it has altered the operation of the pumps and of the generation in order to be able to mitigate the emergency that was being experienced on the power grid. In each of these cases, the amount of reoperation of the system amounted to about 1,000 megawatts of power. Again, it's one of those numbers that you just don't have a good sense for, but it's the equivalent of the ISO being able to take control of a third of the power for the city of Sacramento and be able to adjust it for 1 or 2 hours. Now, there are not many other resources that are available to the ISO to be able to turn to and individually be able to provide that sort of relief. But it, it falls back on the flexibility that's been designed into the State Water Project that allows it to do so. Back toward normal operations, this was mentioned by both Dave and I. What we have is the ability to be able to generate power during the on-peak hours and consume power during the off-peak hours. That has a statewide reliability benefit and an economic benefit, and it's it's very simple to understand. The system is most stressed during the on-peak hours. The more generation that is provided as a result of the hydropower, the more relief provided during that stress period. Likewise, there are periods of time during the off-peak where there is more power being produced than what is being demanded. And that creates a whole new set of problems for the Cal ISO. It's called an overgeneration condition. Having the pump load during that period of time is one means to be able to help alleviate an overgeneration condition. The economic benefits are, again, easy to understand. When the power is the most valuable, the State Water Project is delivering and helping keeping the prices down. The final thing, I'm sorry, the final thing to mention is related to the state's carbon reduction policy. Reduced to 1990 levels by 2020. We do it through a combination of renewable resources, but there's another program, and it's interesting. It's an auction that's being run today. It's the cap and trade carbon auction that is being run. The thing to be aware of is that the auction is one part of it. That's the trade. The cap is that carbon emissions for the electricity sector are set at 97.7 million metric tons for 2012. What's going to happen is that the amount of carbon emissions in the electricity sector are going to be capped at lower and lower levels each year through 2020. And so right now we have the benefit of being able to rely on the hydropower. It doesn't produce carbon when it's generating power. If we lose the hydropower, the flexible generation that's associated with hydropower, your alternatives for that are going to be a more carbon intensive resource. And so we have to be cognizant of the fact that what could be happening is that we're causing more carbon to be produced as a result of the flow objectives.
Tim, I don't know if my colleagues would be as interested in I in this, but if you, after this workshop, could prepare for us something that Jerry raised in response to one of my questions. You know, I always assumed that hydroelectric plants were either operating at below capacity or at capacity, but I didn't realize that you reached a threshold where you needed to bypass and that potential source of power was being wasted. If there's something you could prepare for us without going into some California $50 million study and a graph that I wouldn't understand, I think that's an interesting perspective, and it's certainly something that I wasn't aware of until Jerry responded. So if after this you could get us something, I think it would be helpful.
And so if I understand that, you're interested in a little bit of information about what happens during spill conditions, say, and the bypass of
and what is a normal operating level of these plants, if it's something less than optimum, and what range you have between normal operating conditions and where you would have to spill. I think, you know, if like I said, if it's not too big a deal, I think that would be interesting information. I didn't say that to cut you off, but I wanted to say it before I forgot.
No, I was actually wrapping up, and so I think I've used up my time. Again, we want to be careful that that we don't create additional problems for the state in being able to achieve its energy objectives. And so as the board goes forward, what we want to be able to do is work with you in order to be able to help you understand what the impacts to the hydropower could be. Translate that over to, does that create additional complexity for the ISO during normal conditions, during emergency conditions, in order to be able to maintain the reliability of the power grid? Do we have, are we introducing additional carbon into the generation mix, and are we increasing the costs that are associated with operating the power system? And so, you know, we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how it is that we can translate from a water quality objective that may have a flow criteria in order to be able to take that, translate it into what's the impact on the hydropower system, and then work with others who would be interested in this as well to be able to take that and give you some insights into what are the broader grid impacts that are associated with that. So unless you have any other questions, I'll turn it over to Jerry.
Can I just question? That's very interesting, and I'm trying to figure the question. I know what you're just trying to say is, you know, understand this and work with us and beware, because do you have any instances to date of past water quality control plans or even the biological opinions actually impinging on your ability to manage from an electrical standpoint so far? Has it happened? I wouldn't be surprised if it might have, but has it happened yet?
I don't have a long enough history in working with the water board in order to be able to answer that question. But again, that's something that we can, I could see that Jerry is prepared to pitch in here, so maybe he has some ideas.
And the answer is yes, there are biological opinions that do have an impact on when the water is released, and so that impacts when the generation is going to be. Certainly on the Trainee River, the decision was made there to release more water down the Trainee River for the fishery, and had very specified amounts of water to be released. For example, we're talking about bypass flows. For the Trinity this year, they start the flows and they do the pulse flows starting the first part of May. So they store the water during the winter and then they do the pulse flow starting in May. And this year, I think they released up to 11,000 cubic feet per second for the pulse for about 4 or 5 days, and they started cutting that back. And I think about 6,000 CFS can go through the generators, so there is 5,000 CFS that's bypassed. So, Ron Milligan from the Reclamation would have, at his fingertips a lot more information than I do, but I know that does happen.
Yeah, and no doubt there's a trade-off at times, obviously, for the reasons you stated. But I'm wondering if so far we've experienced things that impinge on the flexibility or something that creates some of the more negative consequences that you're talking about, because everything is a trade-off. I think the challenge for us, just as within water, is to optimize the system for multiple benefits. I think you're making the point that we need to be mindful of the effects on energy generation as yet another effect to be mindful of, and another set of players that we need to be in conversation with. It's clearly not one or the other. One does not trump the other. I'm sure there are instances where optimal electricity generation's killed a lot of fish. So the issue for all of us as resource managers is figuring out how to communicate and optimize, not how to pick one over the other.
Good. Thank you, Felicia, for that question, because you asked the question I had. But also, getting to one of our repeated themes of this workshop is time step. And it was very interesting to me about, the hourly time step of electricity management and the sometimes monthly or annual or daily, depending on the issue with water, the time step that is operated at. So, I mean, when I see that, I instantly see potential flexibility. And you brought up those emergencies. And that was where I was going with my question was, and I would be very interested in this, if we can, have a scenario, because you gave some examples of when emergency was needed and the State Water Project provided it recently. But what is the scenario when, is it even possible when you reach for your backup power or your need to pump and you're not able to do it? That's where we reach that threshold where we're not meeting both, we're not optimizing. And so I was having a hard time grasping, that potential scenario. Do you want to expound on that at all? Like, how could that happen?
If I understand, goes back to something that Dave alluded to in his opening comments, and that is that one way that we have energy storage, essentially, in the power system is the reservoirs that we have. And we're able to use the reservoirs in order to be able to shape the energy production along the lines that Dave had shown, where we have the vast majority of the power being produced during the summer months. If there was something in the water quality objectives that depleted the reservoir earlier in the year, then that would produce a shift in when energy is produced. It would be, you would have less produced during the summertime, more produced during winter and fall, or winter and spring, I'm sorry.
That's interesting. So yeah, there would be a potential occurrence where the natural hydrology of the year created that lack of flexibility, but the concern would be, have our management decisions exacerbated that, created incrementally less flexibility in that scenario. Okay, thank you.
My name is Jerry Tengas. I'm a consultant for the Northern California Power Agency. I apologize, I'm fighting a little bug today, so you might want to push your chairs a couple feet back. But a little bit about NCPA. NCPA is a Joint Powers Agency, currently has 16 members. It has various resources that are utilized to meet the load requirements of the members. It has the geothermal units along the coastline here. It has the hydro facilities, which are on the Stanislaus River. It's got combustion turbines in the valley, and if you've driven by Highway 5 and Lodi there on the right side, you see a big plant that just built a new gas turbine there. Today I want to talk a little bit about more of the financial impacts and operational impacts that flow objectives could have on the Central Valley Project and the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. So kind of three items I'll focus on. First one is the environmental restoration programs of the CVPIA. The second one is how change in flows could reduce the generation value, and third is how it could increase the cost per megawatt hour of hydro generation. A little bit about the Central Valley Project. It's got 14 dams. The keystone of the project is Shasta Dam. It has, it can hold 4.5 million acre feet of water and has a generation capacity of now about 700 megawatts. Next to that is the Trinity Division type thing, where you can release water out of the Trinity, and it can go either down the Trinity River, where you get generation out of the Trinity Dam, or you can release out of the Trinity Dam, also get generation, and have it bring it over into the Sacramento River. And going through Sacramento River, it goes through Judge Francis Carr Power Plant and Spring Creek Power Plant, and then to Keswick Power Plant. Further south is Folsom Dam, which you're all familiar with, and Nimbus. Further south yet is New Moniz generation, and then you got some generation from San Luis. And basically for the CVP, generation occurs when water is released for other purposes. Water is not stored in the project for strictly generation. BPA has that capability, but not CVP. But within the releases that are set, water releases that are set for the day, then you have great flexibility to be able to generate in any particular hour that's needed to be able to match that. And that's where you have the reservoirs like Nimbus below that can catch the water then as you fluctuate your power level, and then still have a constant release for the fishery below that regulation reservoir. Now I'm hitting the wrong button. So did it go too far now? A little bit about the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. It was enacted in the fall of 1992. The purpose of the act was to restore and enhance the fisheries in the Central Valley Project and Trinity River basins. It established 34 activities to be accomplished, and then it created a restoration fund where CVP water and power customers would finance the activities, and today that amounts to about $50 million a year that water and power customers contribute to the restoration fund. And just on the right side there is just some of the activities that are included in the act. Shasta Dam temperature control device. If you've been up there on the upstream side of that, you can see that big device hanging on there. That's controls the temperature as it goes through the water levels. You can go through the penstocks then, and then down into the Sacramento River. I got a lot of fish screens along the Sacramento River that have been funded by the Act, water acquisition for fishery and wildlife, gravel placement if you've been by Nimbus Fish Hatchery, you can see the activities that's going on out there as far as gravel placement is concerned for nesting for fish. Tracy Pump Plant, I think Ron Milligan talked about that yesterday and the work that's going on there. Red Bluff Dam, that was just finished this year. You know, that was a diversion dam which blocked fish from migrating up and down the Sacramento River, and now the gates are up year round, and they got a pumping plant that is used to meet the requirements of irrigation there, and that was funded by CVPI also. And then,
Jared, do you get an annual accounting of this $50 million a year that folks contribute as to what specific projects it went to, or does it just kind of disappear?
there's a total counting. I don't know if there's an annual counting of it, but there's a total counting which you could see where the dollars have been spent.
Okay.
Reclamation has that. And this is just a little more on the funding source. To date, about $1.5 billion has been spent on the restoration fund activities. It was anticipated there'd be 3 primary sources of funding for that. That'd be federal appropriations, state funding, and then contributions by the water and power customers. As you can see, the majority of funding has come from the water and power customers. Federal appropriations a second, and then in 2009 there was $150 million that's contributed by the American Redevelopment and Recovery Act, and again that was used mainly for Red Bluff pumping plant. I want to just walk you through this real quickly as to how the contributions are determined every year, and then on slide 11 I'll bring this back into play as to the importance of this. For 2012 there was Congress appropriated about $52.7 million to be collected from the water and power customers. And so the way it works is the first thing you take a look at is you collect as much as you can from the water customers. And the Act said $6 an acre foot for irrigation water and $12 acre foot for M&I water, indexed from 1992. So to date, that's about $9.38 this year for irrigation and about $18.76 for M&I. So you collect those revenues from water, and then the difference between what you collect from water and what the total appropriations are is what's allocated to power for collection. And so, you know, the kind of takeaway here is any reductions in those deliveries just shifts more costs to power, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple slides. A little bit about if the flow objectives are changed, there's potential impacts that can be made to CVPI. Again, cold water storage, I think Ron Milligan talked about that yesterday. Train River releases, we already talked about that a little bit, about the pulse flow that occurred this year because we had water there and they're concerned about a fish die-off in the Klamath. Gravel replacement, different releases can change the need for gravel replacement. Certainly could impact water that's available for wildlife refuges too. So there's just some things that could be impacted by change in the flow objectives. This here is the generation that's occurred so far for 2012 from the Center Valley project. And as Ron Milligan was talking about yesterday, the first 2 months of this year were a little dry, and so you start collecting, but then in March we had a real good March and April, and so start storing water in those months, and basically the side flows that go in below the reservoirs then was able to meet the requirements for water quality and fishery and so you're able to store the water. And then in the summer months, then you release the water for other project purposes. But when you're doing that, you're also creating generation, and then that's where you have the most value for the generation occurs in these months here. And then you also have the flexibility, as Mary Johannes was talking about yesterday, being able to ramp the CVP units up and down very quickly to be able to match the resources with the loads. So one of the impacts is on value is the value of generation generally is least in the springtime and is most in the summertime. And so if a flow objective happens to change that, so you have more releases in the spring of the year, you're going to have more generation in the spring of the year. And then you're going to have less generation in the summer year when the value is at its highest for CVP customers. Other impacts also is if you have more generated releases in the spring, then your reservoir level is lower in the summertime, and so your head is less, and so the pressure that you have to be able to put the water through the generation is less, and so you get less kilowatt hours per acre foot of generation there. So it does impact generation, and then also, as we discussed already on bypasses there, bypasses certainly impact the generation too if you require more bypasses in the spring of the year to meet whatever the objective might be. And also you could have impacts in very dry years, like in 1992, the water level got so low at New Maloney's that you couldn't even generate electricity for over 5 months because it got to the penstock level and you couldn't get the water through the penstocks anymore. So those are all impacts that could happen with a change. I think this is just a reiteration of the impacts that I've already talked about. I think I've talked about them already. And this slide here is kind of the cost of CVP power over the last 4 years that I wanted to share with you. And what the first line here is this is the cost of operating and maintaining the transmission system and the generators. That's pretty constant every year. The thing that changes the cost per megawatt hour on that is the amount of water you have. And so if you have less water, why the cost per megawatt hour, your generation is greater. So like in 2009, which was a fairly dry year, well, you can see the cost of CVP generation was around $30 a megawatt hour, but the cost didn't change much. But in 2011, which was above average generation year, you can see the cost was $20 a megawatt hour simply because you had more megawatt hours in your generation. The second line is the restoration fund. That's where I was talking about in the line on slide 7 there, where that cost needs to be repaid by the power users too. And so what the green line is the cost of CVP, paying the CVP facilities plus the restoration fund becomes the total cost for CVP generation. And then what the purple line is the market price. So if you'd bought the same power from the market instead of getting it from CVP generation for 2009, why it was would have been a savings of about $9 a megawatt hour, but 2009 was a dry year. 2010 and 2011, you can see the cost of CVP generation was less than the market, and for the last 4 years, when you average them, why the cost of CVP generation and the market is about the same. And so kind of the concern is that there are several things that can be impacted if you have less irrigation deliveries or less water deliveries. 2 things can happen. Number one, you'll have more costs allocated to power for repayment from the restoration fund. And then the second thing is, again, with less water deliveries, power, according to the reclamation laws, has to repay those costs that are beyond the ability of irrigation to pay. So if you have less irrigation deliveries, that means there's more costs they're not paying, and those costs also get allocated to power for repayment. So the concern is, you know, at 80 cents difference over a 4-year average, there's brand loyalty. The customers aren't going to switch. But if you start making changes that impact this too much, then that could impact contributions into the restoration fund. Similarly, if changes it so that the power value becomes less, then with the power value being less, then that also creates a differential there that may impact funding of a restoration fund and maybe even payment of CVP costs. And I think this slide here simply talks about the points I've already covered on this. And last, I think just talking about additional consequences, I think most of these have been talked about already. We're talking about CVPI funding could be impacted, could impact the progress that's been made in CVPIA. I think Tim already mentioned carbon impacts. And so I think my takeaway on this is there could be financial and operational impacts from any changes you make. And I told Tom Boyko I was going to mention him as a resource for the board if you'd care to contact him to find out more details about what I've mentioned here. I think he'd be happy to provide information that you might want to need.
Do all of you understand?
Well, it always has in the past, but we're just saying if you start moving it so it gets to be a wide gap between what the cost of Central Valley project power is, including restoration fund, and what the market is. You know, you may eventually, if you got two gas stations, one selling $4 gas, one selling $5 gas, you may eventually decide that the brand name for $5, you may want to move to the $4 gas, and so.
Well, I appreciate this, and I look forward to the next panel as well. But I think, again, as a question that I put to the panel before lunch, if all the restoration, or if all of our actions had to be put on the shoulders of the state and federal project, that would not be good, because there would be you know, a lot of these impacts, we would see them. But and what you have rightly shown us is, you know, if you do operate just within that system, there are things that we should be considering. But we don't have to operate just within that system. We can operate outside the system as well. I mean, and this is what I hope I will hear from the next panel, because the energy agencies and the water agencies are working very, very close, and Air Board as well, are working very closely together to try to figure out, you know, what can be done to reduce demand in peak times just overall. And you know, no one has mentioned I don't even know that anyone's thought about it, but a more integrated system, both in terms of what gets funded and sometimes it's, I'll just use there are leakages in distribution from a water agency to homes and to businesses. There's pipes leak. Some leak a whole lot more than others. If those leaks were stopped or reduced to bare minimum, which some agencies work on this, then not as much water would be needed to come in to replace that leaky water. And so there are a lot of options that are outside the system but will have an impact on your system. And my guess is that's the future. It's going to be a mixed portfolio. It's gotten more complex, as Tim pointed out. It will, in my opinion, continue to get complex as we get biofuels, as we get lots of other different kinds of fuel cells, and move into different kinds of transportation. So it's, you know, we're on a fast moving train and bullet train, I guess. And sorry. Governor. And so, you know, I just think we're going to have to work together. The key here is working together and making sure that that not all the burden falls on just a few, that it actually gets spread out.
And I have just a couple of concluding thoughts for the panel today. If we could go back to my slide 8 in my presentation. And I actually think this will be a good segue to the next panel as well. So, and this is kind of, you know, bad news and good news. So as you can tell from our presentations, the potential impacts on the electric system from changes in flows or water quality objectives are potentially many. And I've tried to list them here. Impacts on peak loads, on the loss of dispatchability, on reliability, transmission, ancillary services. We would need to look at options to replace lost hydropower, if any, including the system impacts and the costs, impacts on the environment, including restoration activities, impacts on carbon reduction, and lastly, impacts on our ability to incorporate new renewables into the grid. The good news is that there are well-known and well-accepted electricity system models, both for California and the Western system. So we have the ability to do this. It's something that these are tools and models that are used by energy agencies and utilities on a daily basis to do integrated resource planning. With these tools, and again, you'll hear a lot about this from the next panel, we're able to assess these impacts and costs, environmental and carbon impacts, and evaluate other options. We will, of course, need assumptions and inputs from California water system models. That goes without saying. And so what I think we would like to see and propose is just the same kind of thing that Ms. Spivey-Weber was just recommending. That is a joint modeling effort, which would include water agencies and state energy agencies. And of course, we would be happy to participate with our modeling expertise in whatever way you'd like to have us do that. So anyway, thank you very much. And we're happy to answer any additional questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for the offer of help, too. I mean, you all have to manage something at a degree of timing, and electrons aren't very forgiving, the physics of it. It makes water seems, I won't say simple, but it's more forgiving.
Thank you.
I can't believe you guys were here all day long. Thank you.
Are we good, soldiers?
You're very good.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Dennis Peters with the California ISO, and I'm joined here by Dr. Mike Jaski from the California Energy Commission and Nat Skinner from the California Public Utilities Commission. So we have a joint presentation that we'll be stepping through, and we each have our own specific parts of that. So I'll start off kind of providing an overview and some of the background, and I'll pass it along to my colleagues. Let's see. So, let's see, is this, okay. Just figuring out the tools here. So first off, I think what we all wanted to say at the outset is that you know, we're here to say we support achieving state policy goals while also ensuring system reliability and reasonable cost to ratepayers. And I think before I go further in the overview, I think I just want to recognize, you know, a good collaborative effort. Board member Spivey-Weber mentioned, you know, we all need to work together on